You probably know that one of the things I enjoy most about my job is doing weddings. Depending on what's been happening behind the scenes, usually people arrive at the wedding already on a natural high because of the excitement and the anticipation. And so my job really is not to mess that up. I love weddings. I once had the privilege of being part of a wedding between a Christian bride and a Jewish groom, and got to realize that a Jewish wedding ceremony has many rituals that have symbolic significance to the people. I think you will know about the breaking of the glass, which is probably the most famous, well-known one. Usually at the end of the ceremony, a glass wrapped in cloth is placed on the ground and the groom stomps on the glass, breaking it, and the congregation spontaneously cheer, Mazel Tov. I was curious to know what that is all about. What is the significance of the breaking of the glass? So in doing some investigation, I discovered that there are a number of different meanings given to it. So the most traditional is that it represents the destruction of the temple in the 1st century. So it's a remembering. But secondly, it indicates the sanctity of marriage. For just as that glass can never again return to the state it was before, so too the couple, after covenanting themselves to one another, can never return to the state they were in before. They are now in a completely new state, the state of marriage, which is sacred. That's nice, eh? Some people, tongue-in-cheek, say that it's the last opportunity the groom will have to put his foot down. But the meaning that I found most interesting was that the breaking of the glass acknowledges the bittersweet of life. And so in amongst all the joy of the occasion of the marriage, there's this bittersweet moment where they acknowledge that life too brings sorrow and heartache. And as the couple covenant with one another, they covenant to embrace all that comes their way, the joy and the heartache. Bittersweet. So that's why the title of this message is Bittersweet. Life is bittersweet. Think of some of the experiences that we go through when we leave home for the first time. There's the joy of newfound independence and the grief of losing some of our old comforts, like having someone prepare a meal for us. When we get married, there's the joy of having someone special in our life and the grief of losing some of our personal space. When children come along, there's the joy of being part of a miracle, the miracle of newborns. And we had a hand in that, and it's amazing. But also there's the grief of the impact on our time and on our energy levels. When those children grow up and leave home, there's the joy of knowing that we will be able to find things again because they will be where we placed them. And the grief of a home that suddenly has lost some of its life as it becomes quite quiet and empty. So life is bittersweet. And especially now in a world where things change so fast and we are confronted with new reasons to both celebrate and grieve. We long, I think, to have one area of our life that remains constant. And I think we look for that in the church. We want the church to be the one thing that doesn't change. that gives us that constant. And I think it's partly because that's often a place where we experience God's touch on our lives, but also as a result of God's touch, it's often the place where we've invested so much of ourselves by way of our time and energy and money and service. So imagine the pain when change comes along and pays even the church a visit, when we see friends come and go, when we see ministers come and go, when we see the way we do church change. But today I believe that our text from Ezra chapter 3, verses 10 to 13, has got something to say to us. Let me give you some background to this text. You will remember God's people were divided into two. There was the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, don't worry about the dates, but in 722 BC, the northern kingdom was defeated by the Assyrians. Then in 612 BC, the Assyrians were in turn defeated by the Babylonians. The Babylonians attacked the southern kingdom and eventually laid siege to Jerusalem in 586 BC. At that time, the temple was destroyed and many of God's people were taken off into exile. But meanwhile, the Persians were quietly growing from strength to strength, and they then defeated the Assyrians in 539 BC, inheriting those exiled subject people, but with a different approach. They said to them, you may return to your homeland and rebuild your temple and practice your own faith. So they came back. Ezra chapter 3, in the beginning of the chapter, speaks how the returnees come back home and immediately build an altar on the site of the old temple. And as resources come in, they begin to build the foundation of the temple. And in verse 10, we read about the laying of the foundation. Imagine the celebration, the joy, as God's people who've returned celebrate the foundation of a new temple. We read there were trumpets and cymbals and singing and shouts for joy. But did you notice that one bittersweet line? The Bible says that the people could not distinguish the sound of joyful shouting from the sound of people's weeping. How bittersweet that in that moment of wonder and celebration, there was an equal amount of weeping and sorrow. So much so that you couldn't distinguish the one from the other. For there were people present who remembered the old temple and grieved its destruction. Maybe grieved also the change in their identity from once being an equal among peers in the region, having a king, an army of its own, to now being a subject people, dependent on the ruling class for certain privileges. And so they have to imagine a new future, one that is radically different from what they've known before. Ezra has got two messages for us. The first is this: Ezra chapter 3 provides precedent for honoring both joy and grief in times of change. When things change, we have grounds to celebrate something new, but there's also grounds to grieve something lost. Ezra is really saying, don't just focus on the celebration. Don't neglect to grieve. In order to move on, it's essential to be able to grieve. And so we need to honor both, the joy and the grief, the sweet and the bitter. The Bible gives voice to grief by way of lament. Think of the book of Lamentations. I'm particularly fond of chapter 3 from verse 19. The thought of my pain is like bitter poison. I think of it constantly and my spirit is depressed. Yet hope returns when I remember this one thing. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, new every morning. The book of Lamentations. Think of the story of Job, who lost everything and then went toe to toe with God, having it out with God. Why, God? What have I done to deserve this? A beautiful story. I love that story. A third of the Psalms apparently are Psalms of lament. Listen to words from Psalm 13, from verse 2. How long, O Lord, will you utterly forget me? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I harbor sorrow in my soul? How long? The lament. The prophets express lament. Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 18 says, my joy is gone, grief is upon me, my heart is sick within me. Another beautiful one is found in Habakkuk chapter 1 from verse 2. Read it when you go home later. Jesus lamented in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet not my will, but your will be done. And again on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Maybe lament is something we need to recover. Maybe it's a form of prayer that we should relearn. Maybe we should build it into our intercessions. Because grief will not go away unless we give it our full attention. Like a little child demanding attention will not go away until we give the child our attention. Grief is the same. Ryan Williamson writes, when we lose the ability to lament, we lose an opportunity to share with our God the things of this world that are breaking our hearts, and we risk becoming a quietly cynical people. Some of us are not quietly cynical, we're rather noisily cynical. Maybe we need to lament. So, Ezra chapter 3 gives us permission to acknowledge the bitter, the painful, the sorrowful, the heartache, and to grieve it. For it is only in grieving that we are able then to move on and celebrate. The second message that I believe Ezra 3 gives us is this. New beginnings with God are possible no matter how dark and despairing the situation we find ourselves in. Think of the people in Ezra, God's people. They were defeated, their temple had been destroyed, they'd been taken off into exile. Things looked bleak. They were filled with despair. Out of the blue, because of the Persian takeover, God comes and meets them there. And they are given this opportunity to go home and rebuild their temple and begin to practice their faith again. Who would have thought? Who saw that coming? With God, all things are possible. Think of Moses. Moses killed somebody and ran off into the wilderness, where for 40 years he looked after sheep belonging to his father-in-law. And then out of the blue, God comes to him there in the form of the burning bush and sets him on a new path. Think of Jonah. You can't get much darker than the belly of a whale deep down in the ocean depths. And yet, God heard the prayer he prayed from down there and brought him up and set him back on course. Apologies for the pun. So God is in the habit of finding people in the most unlikely places. The Bible is full of stories of God finding people in situations where you would least expect God to find them. Because after all, we're talking about Jesus, who is the hound of heaven, who came down to earth to seek and save the lost. He's not the one hiding away. He's the one seeking us out. We are often the ones who try and hide away. And then I think of Psalm 139. Where can I go to escape from you? Where can I get away from your presence? Nowhere. God is everywhere. And God finds us even in the most God-forsaken situations, and draws us into this mystery of the seen and the unseen. The seen world around us might look very dark and despairing, but all along we know that there's an unseen world all around which contains God. And the unseen world is for us as real, maybe more real, than the seen world. So no matter how bitter the seen world, the unseen world offers hope and promise and life and joy, offers God. I like the way Richard Rohr writes about it. He says, God has given us real eyes to realize where the real lies. The unseen world is for us more real than the seen world. So no matter what the seen world presents, we always have hope. Let me end. Having heard again this beautiful bittersweet moment in the story of Ezra, does that not help us as we renew our covenant relationship with God? So that in covenant with Him, we too can embrace all that comes our way, all the joys and sorrows, all the sweet and bitters. With God by our side, we have nothing to fear. Friends, thank you for listening, and may God bless you in new ways. Amen.